Have you ever wondered why you're addicted to the brand new Bubble Popper Safari game, Bubble Safari from Zynga? Well, I always am. I never understand why I am like compelled to stay up at 3 a.m. in the morning and continue popping bubbles for some reason. And there has to be a psychological pull for why we need engagement. So I decided to go to one of the key people that are in this area, and I contacted Scott Rigby and asked him if he would be so kind as to not only explain it to us, but tell us how we can utilize these tools and make better games. So everyone, Scott Rigby.
Okay, so today we're going to talk a lot about motivation and engagement, and we're going to try to get down to sort of the root level on those things. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. This is me. My background is a little bizarre in that I thought I was going to be a hardcore academic and behavioral scientist. How many of those do we have here today, behavioral scientists? Quite a few, actually. That's great. And so I was sort of on that track, but then I was finishing up right around the time the internet was getting going, and I was a closet geek and a gamer, and so I sort of jumped ship and I started a digital media production company that was actually based here in Manhattan. And we started to build the first generation of, this is back in the really simple days when, just getting something to animate on the screen was like you had really great kung fu. And that's why I was able to pull it off, I guess. But we put together some games and worked with a lot of fairly large media companies in that first company. And that really came together when I then turned to, about 10 years ago, create a company that was specifically about how can we combine, how can we bring the best of behavioral science and what's validated about what we know about the psychology of engagement and sustained engagement and deep motivation, and how can we begin to apply it in places like games, but also in other areas as well. So really immersive is the combination of about 20 years of experience in the industry, so understanding, hey, there are realities that the commercial world has to face in getting things built on time, on budget, et cetera, et cetera. But also really bringing to bear an applied model that has behind it, particularly through the work of my partners at Immersive, Ed Deci and Rich Ryan, about 30 years, almost 40 years now of deep research in what's called self-determination theory and in motivation theory generally, and applying that to really understand what drives human emotion and behavior. And so we're going to talk about a number of those things. So I have kind of the privilege these days of, in any particular day, having a conference call with somebody who's trying to figure out how to tune the assault rifle in their AAA shooter, to then going as the principal investigator on an NIH grant, to figuring out how to build virtual healthcare environments, to talking to financial services people about how do we get people to invest more in retirement. So it kind of makes for a really interesting day. If I confuse those conversations, that gets a little bit weird with my clients, but in any case. There's been a number of publications and that have come out of self-determination theory in particular that are focused in a lot of areas. On the right here, we published a book last year on its application to games, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from that, called Glued to Games. But there have been a number of others. You may remember Dan Pink's book, Drive, which came out a couple years ago, which really came out of 2 days of interviews with my partners, Ed Deci and Rich Ryan, about self-determination theory, how it applies in organizations, and sort of how to motivate. And there's also been applications in the clinic, in sports, in healthcare. So one of the interesting things about what I'm going to talk about today is we didn't start in games, and we're now trying to figure out how to translate that over into the areas that a lot of you care about. We actually started in the areas that a lot of you care about, and we applied it to games over the last 10 years. So it's almost it's already been validated as kind of applicable both across games and in other areas. And in that way, I think it's sort of cool. It's almost a reverse gamification in that sense. I want to start today with the idea of why I think we're all here, why we care about gamification. And there's this idea that we have, which is the Copernican turn, and it's really, rather than an astronomical Copernican turn, which happened hundreds of years ago, where we figured out, well, we're not the center of the universe, we now have a societal Copernican turn. And what I mean by that is that, back in the old days, even when I'm not that old, but I'm old enough that if I wanted to watch the Cosby Show, I better remember to turn on the television at 8:30 on Wednesdays, or that was it, no Cosby Show for me, unless I had that big thing that was the size of a Volvo that I guess VHSs came out about them, but you were really sort of stuck. You had to revolve around NBC, right? And so also in healthcare, it's sort of, if you had a health problem, you made an appointment with the doctor, and that was pretty much it. You didn't have access to, looking things up on PubMed and doing all your own internet research. You had to go and trust the experts. So we had to revolve around the medical institutions. And in education, it was a similar thing. We had, I was very proud. I had Encyclopedia Britannica at home, and you could go and, that's now RIP, I think, as of last year. But really, you just sort of went to school, and again, you didn't know anything, and they knew something, as Jesse said this morning, and you just had to sort of absorb this information, right? And so these institutions and organizations, these were sort of the center of the universe until really very recently, and we just all kind of had to revolve around those institutions. And that has now, of course, begun to change. We now have these devices. All of us probably have not just one, but two of these devices in our laps right now, where we can basically search information in any one of these fields and kind of break these molds. And so it's not that I've got to wait to see the guy in the white coat. It's that I can be, diagnosing whether or not I'm having a stroke right on my iPhone if I have the right medical knowledge, right? I thought this was really fantastic. I haven't really checked out the data on whether that works, but anyway, it's just that this is the way that we're headed. Education, how does a chalkboard compete with iPads and with these other things? This is the big challenge in education, but also remain meaningful to the learning and what the goals we're trying to achieve. And of course, in media, it's, I can watch anything I want at any time. As a matter of fact, if I get boring during this talk, you guys can, pull up, last night's episode of whatever came on last night. I don't know. I don't watch enough TV. But in any case, it's now the point where every individual, organizations, we have to revolve around the individual, right? And so I think that's why we're all here, because what we're really trying to figure out is we're trying to figure out how do we, get people to put us in their orbit when there's so many things that can be kind of competing for their attention, right? And we've got to figure out how to motivate and engage them more deeply. That's really what it's about. So I want to start out today, this seemed appropriate because it's sort of a federal summit, by not talking about the motivations of players, but by kind of our motivations. And I think our motivations really are not so much about games, really. Our motivations are really about engagement. So, it's not that we're trying to become, game developers or, we were supposed to make a game. Yes, I understand that might be what we're trying to do, but really the deeper goal is we see this kind of engagement from games and we're like, I want some of that magic. I'll have what she's having kind of thing, right? And we want to be able to apply that. We want to be able to harness that kind of power for sustained engagement that we see in games and put it to use. But this is an important distinction between games as a goal and games as a tactic that I think is very important to recognize early on. Because, this is the Gartner hype cycle. Everybody seen this before? The hype cycle for emerging technology? I love this. So this is where they try to map, kind of what the hype cycle is. And I just love kind of the labels they put on things. Things like the peak of inflated expectations, right? And so gamification, this is from last year. It was on the ascendancy. Since it's from last year, probably means we may be nearing the peak, right, of inflated expectations. Unfortunately, right after that, if you can read it, is the trough of disillusionment. That sounds like a level in Diablo 3 to me. But in any case, then to technologies that really mean something, there's that slope of enlightenment and that plateau of productivity, and it really comes into its own. And so I actually, the reason I'm excited about gamification is not necessarily all the ways in which I see it implemented today, but the ways in which maybe if we focus on the right motivational goals, we can jump over the sort of trough of disillusionment, right, and get right on with the productivity. We can kind of shorten that cycle. And what I want to talk about today is some of the research into motivation and engagement that I think can help us to do that. Okay, so, and again, it really comes all back to this individual. We all care deeply about the individual, but we care about the individual on many, many levels. In healthcare, we know we need to have a deeper and broader reach. So whenever we're working on a grant application to NIH, one of the main scoring criteria is prove to us that this is going to somehow reach more deeply. And this is when I get excited as an interactive developer, because this has the ability to scale, right, and to be able to reach a broad population. We need to address things like people aren't adhering to their medical plans. It's causing all kinds of healthcare crises, right? In education, I mentioned, we have the chalk versus the iPad. How are we going to overcome these challenges and remain competitive globally? And in training, we need to have greater engagement, deeper processing, increased energy. How are we doing that? And so what we're going to talk about today are sort of principles to keep in mind in order to achieve those goals generally, right? And then talk about how games do that so well, right? But we're starting out, I'm not starting out by talking about games because I actually don't think that games are the ultimate goal. I think games are a tactic. So to get past the hype, a couple of things just to keep in mind. The goal of gamification, I don't think, is to make games, right? I think the goal of gamification is to use what works so well in games to engage people, right? To put it to use to reach these other really important goals that we're trying to reach, right? The goal is really we want to motivate and sustain engagement. That's what we want to do. We're in that societal Copernican turn, and we want to be in orbit around that individual, right? And we want them to keep us in their orbit, right? So game mechanics, when we apply them, they're a tactic, and they're not a goal. I once gave a whole talk on gamification, and somebody during Q&A afterwards mentioned that I never used the word game during the entire talk at the end, and I didn't actually plan it that way. But it was really, again, because I think that, while we do so much work in games, and games are an incredibly powerful tool, again, they're places as a tactic and not necessarily as a goal, right? We need to really motivate and sustain engagement in a way that's because everybody has so many choices ahead of them, right? And so we need to be able to hold their attention in a deeper way, right? So let me turn now to some of the motivational science that underlies what I'm going to talk about today. It comes from something called self-determination theory, which if you go to Google Scholar or do some research on it, this is really one of the leading global theories in human motivation and emotion out there right now. There are hundreds, probably thousands of published, peer-reviewed studies on its application in many, many domains. And in gaming, we've been applying it and developing metrics and models, and we call that the player experience of need satisfaction, or PENS. And I'll be talking about all these things. There's really three basic psychological needs that comprise sort of the core model of self-determination theory and PENS, the player experience of need satisfaction. What we mean by basic psychological needs is that these are needs that we don't need to kind of create. We don't need to entice. They exist. The same way hunger will drive us all to lunch, hopefully very shortly. We have psychological needs that if they are satisfied, we feel good, and if they're not satisfied, we begin to atrophy, right? And so they're always operating for us, and they're always motivating and energizing behavior. And when we engage in experiences that satisfy these needs, we are naturally drawn back to those activities, right? We don't have to play games, so to speak, in order to get people to come back. If we satisfy these needs, they will come back because these are intrinsic and basic needs. So the first need here is the need for autonomy. And that's the need that we all have for our behavior to be volitional, right? We want to feel like we're the authors of the road we're on, right? We want to feel like that our values and our behaviors reflect who we really are, right? Nobody likes to be doing stuff that's like, oh, somebody else told me to do it, or we feel controlled, or any of these other things. That's very thwarting of our autonomy, right? And we also like to feel like there's lots of meaningful and interesting choices, and we get to pick amongst those things, right? And I think as I talk about these things, already you'll begin to see how great games are really good at meeting these needs. And this is really why they work. This is why they're fun, right? These are the underlying principles. The second is the need for competence, right? And that's the need for feeling effective. I want to feel successful in what I'm doing. I want to feel successful moment to moment in what I'm doing, but I also want to feel a sense of growth, right? That I'm elaborating myself. I'm growing my abilities. Nobody wants to do the same job for 20 years, right? And never get a promotion, never change anything. People want to be continually stretching and challenging themselves in almost everything they do. Games are really awesome at doing this. And the third need is the need for relatedness, and that's really the need, to put it simply, it's not having a million friends on Facebook. It's just a feeling of I matter to you, and you matter to me, right? And we kind of have a mutual support of one another, and that creates a satisfaction of this need for relatedness. And when these needs are satisfied, we more highly value whatever activity or context has satisfied those needs, and we're drawn towards those needs, okay? And we actually see a lot of incredibly strong outcomes, more sustained engagement, more value, deeper learning, more vitality and energy. We've applied the model in health. There's been sustained health, improved health, both physical and mental, increased creativity, greater vitality, deeper information processing in learning and training contexts, greater satisfaction at work and in relationships, right? All kind of the big ticket goals that we're working towards in a lot of what we're doing in Games for Change. And also, by the way, more fun. More fun and more sustained fun over time, right? So let's talk about games specifically and the application of the model to games, the player experience of need satisfaction. So what the data has shown, and we've done data now on between 30 and 40,000 gamers over many, many years, probably 40 to 50 different studies, many of them longitudinal, is that the basic needs really are largely what underlies the experience of fun. So when we say fun in games, when we first started to do this work, nobody really had a good definition of fun. Everybody had their idiosyncratic definition of it, and nobody really had any data on what it meant. And as behavioral scientists, we're like, no, we want to operationalize. We're always into that wonky, nerdy, let's measure it kind of stuff, right? So we started to look at this as one of the models for fun, and the data has largely supported it. Games have an incredible capacity to satisfy the core needs I went over: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And we'll talk more about that in a second. The flip side of that, though, and this is also important to keep in mind, and unfortunately I see this in a lot of gamification that's out there today, is that game mechanics can also thwart these needs if we don't really understand the principles of motivation. So I'll just put that out there and we'll talk more as we go along. This is just some data. I'm going to drop a little bit of kind of boring data slides in for those of you who care about such things, because we actually have tons of data behind this, but I've learned that if I slip 5 slides in, that's sort of a lot. So, but this particular one is from a longitudinal study that was looking at how well do the PENS measures measure sustained engagement over time versus just measuring how much fun somebody's having or how much they're enjoying something. And it turns out that if you measure fun and enjoyment and all the PENS metrics in month 1, and then you look out 9 months later, fun doesn't predict whether they're still playing the game or interested in it or engaged in it, but the need satisfaction metrics do. And we have a number of studies that kind of have replicated that result. So let's talk about these needs kind of in games. Why are games so good at these things, right? Well, the first, of course, is competence and mastery. And I think this one is, pretty much a no-brainer. This is where arcade games and video games sort of started, was this, this sense of, Jesse mentioned the flow curve earlier today, the sense of increased, what's sometimes called optimal challenge, being able to grow and get better at something. Games are awesome at making us feel effective, right? And in modern games, we also have a sense of growth. And growth really comes, in some ways, out of play. This is my daughter from a few months ago. What's amazing is, and I'm experiencing this firsthand, any parent knows this, you don't have to do anything. It's not like you gotta hey, come back and get extra bucks, super farm book bucks, or whatever. I don't know what the game is. You don't have to do that to get the kid to play. You just gotta put them down and put something interesting in front of them. And they will stretch their abilities, and then they'll get kind of bored with that thing and then want to try something else. That's the intrinsic need for competence really at work, right? One of the ways that games are so awesome at doing this is really the informational feedback that they're able to provide that we can't get in real life, right? So I'll take, as one example, Guitar Hero, and just talk about the density of informational feedback that as you're playing that game, because that's really a pure competence game. You're getting what we call kind of granular competence feedback. Every single note, did I hit the note, did I not hit the note? The screen flashes, you're kind of getting that every single moment. Then you're getting sustained competence feedback. You're looking at that rock meter, right? It's going up, you're hearing the roar of the crowd, so I know that I'm not just hitting a note here and there, but I'm actually keeping my streak going, right? And then you're also getting cumulative competence feedback. So there's yet another layer. So I know how I did on that particular, concert, and then I get to kind of progress and move up. And so there's all these different layers happening immediately. I wish real life was like that. Imagine if in real life you're walking around with a HUD, and I guess this is the promise of augmented reality, but I really worry about getting hit by a bus with augmented reality. But you kind of imagine if you had a little mini radar, so you knew when somebody you didn't like was around the corner, and you just go, okay, you'd be much more competent, right, in your day-to-day life. But this is what games do that's so powerful. And so when you're planning your different projects, one of the things is to think through, when I'm planning mechanics and UI, how am I providing true informational feedback that allows the person to be able to grow and elaborate their skills and abilities, because that's what will be satisfying to competence, right? And it really needs to be meaningful growth, right? So this kid is smiling not just because he finally grew past, 48 inches or whatever it is, but because as a result of doing that, he's now able to do something new, right? He's able to kind of, ride the ride or do a new experience or grow somewhere. And games are really awesome at this. So, Minecraft, you kind of, as you increase in your crafting ability, you actually get the ability to make more and more interesting tools, which then opens up new opportunities in the world. So it's not just about going from level 1 to level 2. We've done research. If people go from level 1 to level 2, it's like, you went to level 2. Unless there's something meaningful that happens there, they don't care. It doesn't have any value whatsoever. Something meaningful has to happen with respect to their growth from level 1 to level 2. So as you're working on progression mechanics in your games or your projects, that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, right? I'm going a little fast because I know we're about 10 minutes behind schedule, so I apologize if I'm sounding a little bit like an auctioneer here. The second thing I want to talk about is relatedness, right? And relatedness is that sense of meaningful connection to others, that I matter, right? Games are awesome at communicating this when they're done well, right? So if you look at the MMO structure, right? If I'm a squishy and I'm hanging back and I'm casting spells, I have to have a tank up front. But the tank also needs me because we got to take down the bag. So we're working together, right? That's what makes raids so exciting. For those of you, I'm sure nobody wastes their time on MMOs here, but let's say you've played World of Warcraft once or twice. You have that experience of doing something together as a group, which is really exciting. I also want to say, with respect to first-person shooters, that we saw some of the staggering numbers on Call of Duty. $1 billion, and these are huge numbers that are racking up. One of the amazing things about Call of Duty and a number of other first-person shooters is how much they're able to sustain engagement. And a lot of it, you might not think running around shooting people would build a lot of, you banner to me, this sort of rainbows and unicorn squishiness, but it really does, because I need to be working with my team in order to achieve those goals, right? And so the game mechanics themselves have been built in order to foster that sense of mutual dependence, which is a really important thing to keep in mind. I also want to make the point that it isn't just with other people, right? Other live people. It can be with your computer-generated characters. A lot of times, I don't know what it is about game developers, but they write really cranky dialogue for their NPCs, right? So you go up and you click on a guy, you're trying to have a conversation, and the guy's like, "Get away from me, go away." It doesn't matter that you've saved half the world. They're still really cranky at you for whatever reason. And it's probably because it's just kind of tossed in at the end. The reality is that if you change a lot of those interactions to be more positive, you will actually see an increase in the satisfaction and a greater likelihood of re-engagement with the game, right? Some of the examples I have up here, one of the ones that's a big one, of course, there's squad play in Mass Effect 3. The dog character in the Fable series, particularly Fable 2, we found was a really powerful character. People had people play that game, remember playing with the dog, right? Developed this emotional connection to the dog. And it turns out that it's not just because there's a little dog running next to you, is the dog actually does stuff. It really supports you. It'll go find cool things for you to dig up. You really feel like the dog cares about you, that you matter to the dog. I mean, we all know it's a computer-generated dog, but it doesn't matter. People have this kind of connection, and so when you're building it could be something simple like the way you're scripting your characters, or in how you're kind of developing the partnerships that players have with computer-generated characters. Very important to keep in mind this notion of mattering to one another. The third need is the need for autonomy, right? And autonomy, I talked about, is a sense of volition. Games are awesome. I remember when I was a kid, before there were games, you have a choice, like I can go to bowling or I can go to the mall. There wasn't really a whole lot to do, and the mall got boring after a while, right? But now I can go into all these fantastic worlds where there's a tremendous amount of what we call what-if thinking. Well, what if I, traveled here or went there? I mean, here's Red Dead Redemption, which is, of course, a big successful title, and it just has all these opportunities for action, right, in the game world. Games are really fantastic at this. True, this is an 8-figure budget game, but it doesn't have to be an 8-figure budget game. Again, you can look at Minecraft. Right? This is a game that was, developed, on a shoestring, but it created core mechanics that created a lot of this dense what-if thinking, that people felt like they could really volitionally engage and have a lot of meaningful opportunities for creativity and action, right, in the mechanics. So it's a key thing to think about. A second component I want to mention, though, in respect to autonomy, is this idea of what we call volitional engagement, right? Games have the possibility. We published a paper in a Journal of Educational Research called Virtual Worlds and the Learner Hero. And the idea here is that video games allow you to kind of be a hero, right? They allow you to have a reason for doing things even if you don't have a lot of choice, right? So what a bad video game will do is they will make you go down this hallway because there ain't any other place to go. All the doors are locked and whatever, windows are boarded up. But what a good video game will do is they'll give you a reason to go down that hallway, right? They will care. They don't want to drag you down the hallway. They want you to volitionally go down that hallway, right? And so the idea here is, I don't know what I leaned on there, but the idea here is to create a meaning or a rationale for players to want to go down that path, and they will feel autonomous and satisfied in doing so. So the goal in design really is, because these needs already exist, is really facilitating their satisfaction. What's awesome about this is that you don't actually have to go out and create a lot of artificial things. These needs actually already exist, and they exist at a really core basic level, right? So you want to become the catalyst in your game designs that are connecting activities to core needs, right? And needs, by the way, will almost always outweigh just kind of wants, which are transient. I may want a hamburger right now. I'm sure we all kind of want something right about now. But that's going to go away. These needs sort of underlie, these psychological needs are much more powerful. The last idea I want to talk about is the idea of motivation as a continuum. Because I think there's been a lot of discussion about motivation as there's intrinsic motivation, which is good. We want people to be intrinsically motivated. Then there's extrinsic motivation, and that's evil. We don't want people to be extrinsically motivated. And it turns out that that's not a fair distinction. Motivation is a continuum. At one end of the spectrum, yes, we have intrinsic motivation, which really is defined as the goal of the activity is the activity itself, right? My daughter plays just because for the sheer love of playing. And that's awesome. And if you can create that and move people towards that in your game or your simulation, that's fantastic. But in real world circumstances, we actually sometimes have to, people have to do things at their jobs. They've got to go through things that they may not choose to do for the sheer fun of it, right? So extrinsic motivation, we need to understand that as a continuum. On one end of the continuum is what you could call kind of the evil side, and that's the purely external. It's like, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pay you to do this thing because God knows that's the only way I'm going to get you to do it. It's just a purely extrinsic thing I dangle in front of you, right? Then there's something called introjected regulation, right? Introjected is when I'm not dangling something in front of you, but I make you feel kind of pressured into doing it, or I shame you into doing it, or I make you feel guilty about not doing it, right? And this is a big thing that goes on in a lot of games. And I have some examples of that coming up. Then we move more towards the positive side of extrinsic motivation, and there's a type of motivation called identified, which is really that the self begins to really endorse the goal that they're trying to reach. They're still trying to reach a goal, right? So extrinsic motivation means the activity is instrumental. I'm trying to do the activity to achieve something else. But if I really value that goal, then it becomes identified. And then there's a lot of sustained engagement that flows from that. And the fourth, which we won't spend a lot of time on, is that over time I begin to then integrate those goals over time. And I just want to touch, so the goal really is to internalize and to build designs that kind of internalize people and move them towards the right side of this chart, right? And so we're just going to talk for 1 or 2 minutes on that, and then we'll wrap up. So what do we want to avoid in gamification? We want to avoid controlling or thwarting people, okay? Extrinsic, purely external rewards will often do this. And this is probably my biggest sort of caution, I would say. And I talk to developers about this all the time, right? There's something that is very well documented. It's called the undermining effect. If I start to pay you for something that you are already doing and that you like to do, you will like to do that thing less, and you will be more likely to disengage from it. And that's just a fact. And if anybody wants to dispute that, come up to me afterwards. I'll kill a small tree and print out all the papers on it. Okay? So whenever we're starting to just kind of throw things at the player for the sake of like having something to throw at them, but isn't really meaningful for need satisfaction or growth, we run the risk of undermining their motivation and actually having them detach from sustained engagement, right, and from deeper processing. Here's one study that came out recently I want to show. This was looking at fMRI scans, right, and looking at the effects of rewarding versus not rewarding. And so here in session 1, at the very top is a control group, didn't receive any extrinsic rewards. They were engaging in kind of an interesting task, though. So you can see that the reward centers are kind of lighting up. All right? The bottom group got an extrinsic reward. And you can see their reward centers, that's the red bar, lit up even more. And this is the rationale behind, like, what? This seems to prove we should give rewards, right? So now, if you go forward to another round, when you take the reward away, guess what happens? It inverts, right? Same activity, randomized controlled sample, the whole 9 yards. But now what happens is the people that got the reward no longer care. Their brains go dark. They don't care about the activity any longer. This is an example of the undermining effect. And there's lots of other examples in the literature. Here's another example of the Biggest Loser show, why I hate that show, why the Biggest Loser model is completely wrong. The top line actually shows that this shows weight loss, so lower is better, right? People who were given a high financial motivation actually didn't lose any weight and actually started to gain weight by 20 weeks out. People who were given a low financial motivation but were more supported around their needs actually showed sustained weight loss, right? And again, there's lots of examples of this. I'm just going to go through these quickly. So that's extrinsic rewards. Now, introjective rewards are these pressure mechanisms, right? I've got to get out of this meeting not only to eat lunch, but my crops are withering. I feel this kind of pressure. And so, so here's an example this is from Cityville. And this is how subtle these things can be. This is why it's really important to think about these things in a nuanced way. So here you're playing your social game, and you get this little pop-up, and there's a puppy, and he's lost, and will you share this with your friends, and it'll go viral, and I'll bring him into the game, and it'll be great, right? So what's wrong with that? Well, I mean, and what's great about it is you have a choice. You don't have to, save the puppy and give it to your friends. You can just close the window. So you have choice. I'm not controlling you. I have 2 Labrador retrievers. All right? That button may as well just say that. Right? It's because that's my emotional experience, right? And so this is the kind of thing that we need to always be aware of, right? And just anytime you can present kill puppies in a presentation, it's a win. So anyway, anything, and this is why I want to say something about when you're looking and doing your player experience testing. There's tons of data out there on behaviors, and we're getting really good, right? Business intelligence, like collecting all this data about how people are behaving. It's really important you also are looking at their motivations for why they're behaving. Because you can get people to save the puppy, but if they feel like they had to or they feel guilty about it, they're more likely to disengage. So that's the important part of that. So we want to avoid things that are external or introjective. And we actually see over time, and I'm just going to move a little faster because we're out of time, but intrinsic motivation is actually a stronger predictor of sustained engagement, likelihood of re-engaging with games over time, than intrinsic motivation. I want to now talk, though, about a good type of extrinsic motivation. Let's say this is a student, and she's studying for an orgochemistry exam. I don't know if anybody was pre-med, but orgochemistry is not terribly fun, right? So there's nothing really fun about that event, right? And we all have projects in which people have to do things that aren't necessarily fun, right? So trying to say, we're going to make it all intrinsic, and I think that that's kind of a fallacy. Some stuff just won't be, and it doesn't have to be. Because the goal could be, I want to be a doctor because, I want to really help and, matter to my patients and really help them out. I want to be a researcher and gain my skills and abilities. I want to have lots of choices available to me. The orgochemistry exam might not be terribly interesting, and it may never be interesting. But if the goals are actually need satisfying, then you'll see people feel autonomous and they will stay engaged with the task. And I think that's a really important nuance that's often lost, okay? An instrumental goal can be truly valued, all right? And we call that identification. I'm not going to go over this. It just shows, I'm assuming we can share these decks. So this just shows kind of the level of nuance that as you're going through a project that you can begin to ask very specific questions about how these needs are being satisfied in your design. And again, Constance, we're making these decks available to people, right? Somehow? Right. We'll figure it out. But then that allows you to kind of do these trade-off analyses, which we actually will look at whether a particular feature or mechanic is satisfying 1 need, 3 needs, 2 needs, and we will see a direct relationship between that feature and whether people value it and and its impact on sustained engagement over time, right? So really the goal is move people towards internalization. Just a couple more slides to show the value of this model. You can see these same labels across the top: external, introjected, identified, intrinsic. This is a study around academic goals, values, and learning Look down here at learning strategies, deep process versus surface process. I mean, right over here, the more identified and intrinsic, very highly correlated with deeper processing, right? Whereas surface processing is much more related to people feeling controlled or externally motivated for their learning, okay? You can look at exercise and you see the same pattern. Basically, I'll just say bigger numbers and asterisks are a significant correlations for ease of use here. So you can see that, you know, external regulation, things like the Biggest Loser model, negatively related, right? Identified regulation, intrinsic motivation are more highly related, right? And you can kind of combine those into what we sometimes call controlled motivation and autonomous motivation. This is the scariest chart, but luckily then we're at the end. But this is a path model. And really what I want to show about this is looking at persistence as a function of coaching, right? So coaching and motivation. And you can see all the way on the left, you see autonomy support, right? Autonomy support means that as your coach, I'm actually focusing, and you can think about this in terms of your games and your designs, I'm focusing on supporting those core needs, not controlling you, but supporting those core needs, right? Controlling is, I think, self-explanatory. And what you see here is that the intrinsic and identified regulatory styles that come out of autonomy support are correlated with this persistence, particularly almost 2 years out. Whereas you see a negative relationship with that over time, right? I think this is incredibly important for so many areas we're trying to tackle in healthcare and education and everywhere else. And so, you know, games just happen to do this really well. They provide a density of these satisfactions, right, when they're done well. And we've touched on that. There's a consistency to the satisfactions. I know that if I get 10,000 points, I move to level 2, and I get, you know, whatever the reward is for that thing that's going to help me grow, right? In real life, I may work my butt off and get passed over for promotion and go, you know. The best quote that I heard was a guy who, when we first published some research on this, said, yeah, you know, that's why I like games, because I've been grinding and grinding at my job for 20 years and I've never leveled up. In games, you don't have that problem. And also, there's the immediacy, right? These things are available to us right now. Like if I had to, if somebody put a gun to my head, that would be controlling, so I wouldn't recommend it. I could be in a virtual world like within 3 minutes from now, right? And so it's the immediacy of being able to get into these worlds. And if they're needs satisfying, you know, that's an awesome combination of things. I unfortunately didn't bring any business cards, or just all my contact information, but I forgot my business cards. But I'll just wrap up there, and I think I did pretty well at catching us up a bit on time. But do we have time for a question or two?
Sure. Go ahead for one question.
And thanks very much, yeah.
As you are doing research to understand psychology of engagement in games for your clients, what games do you play?
What games do I play?
Yeah, what games do you play? I mean, as a researcher.
Oh, as a researcher, I you know, what a pain. I have to play all of them. I mean, it's so, my wife, I keep explaining to her, but honey, it's my job. Actually, you know, but personally, I gravitate towards games that are really high in autonomy satisfaction. That turns out to be pretty true of a lot of genres. So you look at a game like Civilization. You know, I've been playing Civilization since it came out, I don't know, almost 20 years ago now. And it's a game that I'll kind of return to over and over again because it engages in a lot of that kind of what-if thinking. Or I'll go into games like MMOs because I get that combination of relatedness satisfaction, but I have a choice. If I want to have a high competence satisfaction, I might go on a raid with my friends. But if I just want to explore and engage in kind of that what-if thinking, I get a lot of autonomy satisfaction from that. But really, when I'm playing a game now, it's in some ways it's no fun because I'm just analyzing the mechanics and whether or not they're supporting or thwarting. It's like, you know, it's no fun to be around me when I'm playing a video. Interesting question. Yeah, one more and then we'll stop for lunch.
Where do you see competition fitting in?
Right, so competition, great question. So, you know, what we see in competition is that when you have mechanics in competition that help people, it's sort of like stone sharpening stone, right? So people really love competition when there's the opportunity for me competing against you to help me increase my competence and be able to grow and get stronger. Where people don't like competition, and by the way, the game can support that in a lot of ways. If you look at leaderboards, for example, we've actually analyzed the different information on leaderboards, and the information that's most effective is the information that helps me get better at my particular skill. I might see that you scored more damage even though you're the same class as me, and I might text you and say, hey, what were you doing? And then we kind of, you know, we learn from each other. The stuff that isn't good is when there's just a big laughing face on the screen. It's like, you lose. You know, we've seen that as well. Anything that's kind of shaming or not informational. But it's really that stone sharpening stone.